The footage runs for 11 seconds. A small boy in a red jacket walks across a gravel lot behind a man in a dark coat. Beside the man, a black dog trots on a short lead, its tail low, unbothered. The boy's steps are quick, almost skipping, the way children move when they are following someone they trust, or someone they have simply decided in that instant to trust. Then the frame cuts. A delivery van passes in front of the camera, and when it clears, the lot is empty. That is the last confirmed image of Noah Whitmore, 4 years old, taken at 11:42 in the morning on the 12th of June 2009 at the edge of the Ashford Summer Agricultural Fair in North Yorkshire, England. No one who reviewed that footage in the days afterward could say with certainty who the man was, or where he had come from, or why a 4-year-old would walk toward a stranger without a sound of protest. Investigators would return to those 11 seconds more times than they could count over the following 17 years, freezing the frame, enhancing the grain, measuring the shadow the man cast against the gravel. And for 17 years, the trail ended exactly where it began, at a delivery van passing in front of a camera at the wrong possible moment. We are going to walk through this case the way it was actually built, file by file, year by year, because the ending, and there is an ending which is more than most of these cases can offer, only makes sense once you have stood where the investigators stood, not knowing what they didn't yet know. Before we go further, if you are new to this archive, welcome. This channel exists to reconstruct real human situations, missing persons cases, the families left behind, and the slow, often unglamorous work of finding the truth. If you have been here before, you already know how these stories tend to unfold, quietly and then all at once. Thank you for returning. Now, back to that Friday morning in Ashford. The fair had been running since 8 that morning, the way it did every June on the flat pasture behind the old grain co-op just outside town. There were livestock pens, a produce competition, a beer tent for the fathers, and a small fenced play area where the youngest kids were meant to stay while their parents drifted between stalls, half watching, half distracted by conversation. It was the kind of arrangement that had worked for decades in a town where everyone still, more or less, knew everyone. Noah's parents, Eleanor and Michael Whitmore, had arrived a little after 10. Eleanor would later tell investigators that she remembered almost nothing unusual about the morning. No strange car in the lot, no unfamiliar face lingering too long near the play area, no argument, no warning. She remembered Noah eating half a sausage roll and refusing the rest. She remembered him laughing at another boy's dog. She remembered turning to speak to a neighbor, Carol Ashby, about a church fundraiser, for what she believed was less than 2 minutes. When she turned back, Noah was not by the fence. She called his name. She was not yet frightened, not in those first seconds. Children wandered at fairs. He had likely followed another family toward the animal pens, or found the face-painting queue more interesting than his mother's conversation. She walked the length of the play area. She checked the queue. She asked Carol if she'd seen him. Carol had not. It took 11 minutes for Eleanor to alert fair organizers, and 4 more for someone to radio the 2 off-duty constables working security near the main gate. By the time North Yorkshire Police formally logged the disappearance at 12:14 p.m., 32 minutes had passed since the last time anyone could confirm they had seen Noah Whitmore standing on his own 2 feet in his own life, as the boy his parents knew him to be. What none of them yet understood, what would not become clear for 17 years, was that the boy they were searching for had already, in some sense, stopped existing. Somewhere between the fence and the parking field, whatever came next in Noah's life had already begun, and it would not resemble anything the search parties combing the riverbanks that afternoon could have imagined. I find myself returning to that detail every time I revisit this file. Not the abduction itself, but the sheer ordinariness of the morning around it. No raised voices, no struggle, just a boy walking, and a dog, and a van passing at exactly the wrong moment. It makes you wonder how many quiet mornings like this one are hiding something none of us would ever think to look for. By 1 o'clock, the fairgrounds had been sealed. By 2, the first search dogs had arrived from Northallerton. And by nightfall, North Yorkshire Police had opened one of the longest unresolved missing child investigations in the region's modern history. A case that would not close in any real sense until a football broadcast 17 years later put a stranger's face on a screen in the Whitmores' living room, and Michael Whitmore reached, without quite knowing why, for the remote to freeze the frame. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what that frozen frame meant, we first have to understand what was lost in the hours, days, and years before it. Starting with the search that began that same afternoon, a search that would eventually involve more than 600 volunteers and would end, after 72 exhausting hours, with a single red baseball cap lying half buried in gravel at the edge of a parking field. Eleanor Whitmore later described those first hours as a kind of falling that never hits the ground. Grief for a missing child, she meant, has no flaw. Every day carries the possibility of an answer, and every night takes it away again only to hand it back at sunrise slightly heavier. Michael Whitmore, quieter by most accounts, gave almost no interviews in the early years. Neighbors remembered him instead as the one who kept driving the back roads around Ashford after the search team stood down each evening, headlights sweeping over hedgerows and gates. It is worth noting something the file makes clear even this early. Nothing about the Whitmores nor the fairground itself gave investigators reason to suspect the family. Parental involvement was ruled out within 48 hours through witness corroboration, phone records, and the consistency of Eleanor's account across dozens of interviews. Whatever had happened to Noah, it had happened to him alone, in a crowd of hundreds, in perhaps 90 seconds. By the second morning, the fields around Ashford looked less like farmland and more like a staging ground for a small army. Portable lighting towers stood at intervals along the tree line. A mobile command unit, borrowed from the regional police headquarters in North Allerton, had been parked at the edge of the co-op lot, its radio chatter constant, low, and clipped. Volunteers arrived in numbers no one had anticipated. Farmers who closed their gates for the day, retired school teachers, off-duty firefighters from 3 neighboring towns, students home from university for the summer. By the end of the first full day of searching, the volunteer log recorded just over 400 names. By the end of the second, that number had passed 600. Search coordinators divided the surrounding area into a grid, radiating outward from the fairground in quarter-mile rings. On the theory, standard in child disappearance cases, that a young child on foot rarely travels far without being seen. But Noah was not wandering. A 4-year-old does not vanish silently from a fenced play area in a crowd without either extraordinary luck or deliberate assistance, and the 11 seconds of recovered footage suggested the latter. The search covered the River Ash to the north, wooded parcels belonging to 3 farms to the east, and most exhaustively, the rural lanes and disused barns within a 5-mile radius. Cadaver dogs were used cautiously and, per the case file, without result. A detail that offered the Whitmores a strange, cruel comfort. Helicopters made repeated passes over denser woodland where foot searchers could not easily go. None of it produced a lead. If you've ever taken part in a real search effort, even a small one, you'll know how quickly hope and exhaustion start to occupy the same hour. Searchers described the first night as tense but focused, driven by adrenaline and the belief that a child left outdoors overnight would surely be found, cold and frightened by morning. By the second night, that belief had begun to fracture, and by the third, the language coordinators used with volunteers had shifted, carefully but unmistakably, from search to recovery, a distinction few outside law enforcement fully register, but one that every volunteer standing in that field understood, without needing it explained. At 4:50 p.m. on the third day, a volunteer named Trevor Higgs, working the outer edge of the parking field near a low stone wall, found a child's red baseball cap half buried in loose gravel roughly 60 yards from where the camera had last captured Noah. It had clearly been there some time. The fabric was damp through gravel dust worked into the stitching. Higgs did not touch it. He marked the location, radioed the command unit, and waited nearly 40 minutes for a forensic officer to process the scene properly, a decision later credited with preserving what little evidentiary value the cap held. DNA testing confirmed within days that the cap belonged to Noah. It became, and would remain for the next 17 years, the single physical piece of evidence directly tying the child to any location beyond the fairground fence. but a cap in a parking field 60 yards from the last sighting told investigators almost nothing they didn't already suspect. It confirmed a direction, away from the fair, toward the lot where visiting vehicles were parked in unmarked rows on open grass, without confirming a destination. There were no vehicle registrations logged for that field, no second camera, and as far as investigators could determine, no witnesses who had seen anything happen there during the window in question. By the end of the 72-hour mark that so often defines the earliest, most survivable phase of a child disappearance case, North Yorkshire Police had exhausted nearly every conventional search avenue available to them. The volunteer search would formally scale back the following week, though smaller efforts, organised privately by neighbours and church groups, would continue on and off for months. The official investigation, meanwhile, shifted its focus from where Noah might be found to who might have taken him. A shift that, as any investigator will tell you, is often far more difficult and far slower than the search itself. I think about that cap a great deal when I revisit this file. How something so small, so nearly overlooked in a field of gravel and weeds, was in some ways the loudest piece of evidence in the entire case, and yet told investigators almost nothing about where to look next. Sometimes the evidence you find only proves how much further you still have to go. The investigation that followed would run, quietly and with diminishing public attention, for the better part of 2 decades. And for most of that time, it would circle one theory arrived at within weeks of the disappearance and never meaningfully replaced, that whoever took Noah Whitmore from that fairground knew the area, knew the timing, and knew with unsettling precision exactly how much time they had before anyone would think to look. Detectives interviewed every stallholder and off-duty officer working the gate that day, cross-referencing statements against the fair's vendor registration list. They pulled fuel receipts from the single petrol station on the road out of Ashford and requested traffic camera footage from the nearest motorway junction, reviewing hours of grainy recordings for any vehicle matching no local registration. Nothing surfaced. Whoever had taken Noah had either avoided every camera in the region by careful planning or by extraordinary chance, and after several months investigators privately conceded they could no longer say which explanation was more likely. A handful of early tips came in from the public, a woman who believed she'd seen a man matching a rough description walking a black dog along a canal path 2 days later, a lorry driver who thought he recalled a child asleep in a stranger's car at a service station further south. Each led nowhere concrete, the descriptions too vague, the country too large for a black dog and an unremarkable man to be traced from memory alone. By the time the volunteer search formally stood down, Eleanor Whitmore had already begun what would become a lifelong habit, carrying a small stack of flyers wherever she went, offering them to strangers with a quiet, practiced politeness. It was, in its own way, the true beginning of the next 17 years, not the search itself, which would wind down within the month, but the private, unending version of it that only a parent in her position could sustain. There is a particular kind of anniversary that has no ceremony attached to it, no cake, no gathering of relatives, only a date on a calendar that a family cannot stop marking year after year, whether or not anyone else remembers to ask. For the Whitmores, the 12th of June became that date. Not a birthday, not quite a memorial, since there was never a body, never a funeral, never the terrible but at least final closure that a funeral provides. Just a Friday, most years, that arrived regardless of how prepared anyone felt for it. In the first few years, the anniversary drew modest but consistent attention from regional newspapers, a photograph of Noah at 4, the same one used in the original police appeal, run alongside a short update, noting that the case remained open, that the reward for information had been renewed, that North Yorkshire Police continued to ask anyone with knowledge of the events of June 2009 to come forward. By year 5, the coverage had shrunk to a paragraph. By year 10, it appeared only in the regional paper's online archive, rarely printed, rarely shared. The world, as it tends to do, had moved on. The Whitmores had not and could not, and in truth had never expected to. Eleanor kept a version of that photograph in nearly every room of the house, not obsessively, family members would later insist, but consistently, the way some households keep a cross on the wall or a wedding photograph on the mantel. It was simply part of the architecture of the home. The photograph showed Noah at the fair, weeks before his disappearance was even a possibility anyone had considered, laughing at something just out of frame, wearing the same red jacket he'd have on the day he vanished. And on the left side of his neck, faint but visible if you knew to look for it, was a small oval birthmark, roughly the size of a thumbprint, slightly darker than his skin. It was not a detail investigators emphasized publicly. Birthmarks, unlike fingerprints or dental records, are notoriously unreliable identifiers on their own. They can fade, alter subtly with age, or simply go unnoticed by anyone not specifically looking for them. But Eleanor mentioned it in nearly every interview she gave over the years, almost as a private ritual rather than an investigative strategy. "If you ever see a boy with a mark like that," she told one regional reporter in 2014, "on the left side of his neck, just under the jaw, please just ask him his name." No one for 12 more years ever did. The Whitmore's marriage, like many subjected to this particular, sustained form of grief, bent under the weight of it without breaking entirely. Michael took a transfer to a distribution depot outside Harrogate in 2013, partly for work, partly several relatives suggested privately, because Ashford itself had become difficult to live in. Every street corner, every fairground held a memory neither of them could set down. Eleanor stayed nearer the original house for several more years before eventually joining him. They did not divorce. They did not, by most accounts, ever stop believing Noah was alive somewhere, though neither could have told you if pressed. What that belief was actually built on beyond the simple absence of a body. If you have ever known a family living inside a case like this, you'll recognize the particular exhaustion in that kind of hope. Not the dramatic, tearful hope of films, but a quieter, almost administrative kind, renewed each year through a phone call to the family liaison officer, a repeated request to keep the file active, a birthday cake that got smaller and smaller, until by year 8 or 9 it stopped being bought at all. North Yorkshire Police, for their part, never formally closed the case, though the working investigation team shrank over the years from a dedicated unit to, eventually, a single detective sergeant, reviewing the file periodically alongside an active caseload of newer crimes. Detective Sergeant Priya Nair inherited the Whitmore file in 2019, a full decade after the disappearance, and would later describe her first read of it as one of the strangest cold cases I've ever worked, because there was almost nothing wrong with the investigation itself. Everything that could reasonably have been done had been done. The case simply ran out of places to look. That, more than anything, is the particular cruelty of a case like this one. It is not that the investigators failed. It is that an investigation, however thorough, can only follow leads that exist. And for 17 years, the only lead anyone had was a single frame of CCTV footage, a damp red cap, and a mother's insistence, repeated to reporters who grew fewer each year, that somewhere a boy carried a small oval mark on the left side of his neck that no amount of time could fully erase. None of them, not Eleanor, not Michael, not Detective Sergeant Nair, not a single reporter who filed a paragraph each June, could have predicted where that detail would eventually resurface or how. It would not come from a tip line or a forensic breakthrough or a confession. It would come, of all places, from a football stadium on the other side of a television screen during 20 seconds of footage that was never meant to matter to anyone at all. The family received occasional false hope in those middle years, the kind that tends to arrive in cases like this one, and leave without warning. In 2016, a boy of similar age was briefly reported missing in a neighboring county, and for 11 hours, the Whitmores allowed themselves against their own better judgment to wonder. In 2020, an anonymous letter claiming knowledge of Noah's whereabouts was traced, after tense weeks, to a man with a history of inserting himself into high-profile cases for attention rather than information. Each moment cost the family something that never fully returned. Eleanor would later call them little deaths, smaller than the first one, but somehow just as exhausting. Detective Sergeant Nair, reviewing the file in 2019, made one decision that would prove quietly important. She requested that the original photograph, the one showing the birthmark clearly, be digitally reprocessed and archived in a national database used for cross-referencing missing persons cases. It was routine, rarely producing results. Nair has since said she did it, Because it cost nothing to try and because Mrs. Whitmore never gave anyone a reason to stop looking. Neither she nor anyone else could have known that this same digital record would later be pulled up within minutes of the broadcast footage arriving at her desk. The interview lasted 18 seconds, start to finish, and it was never meant to be memorable. It aired on the evening of the 9th of July 2026 during a national broadcaster's pre-match coverage outside a stadium hosting one of the tournament's later round fixtures. A reporter, working the crowd for quick reactions ahead of kickoff, moved between fans with a handheld microphone, the kind of filler segment that runs during every major tournament, gone from most viewers' memories before the final whistle blows. Among perhaps a dozen fans interviewed that evening, one was a young man in his early 20s wearing a supporter's scarf who offered a brief, unremarkable comment about the match ahead before the camera cut away to the next voice in the crowd. Michael Whitmore was watching that broadcast from his living room in Harrogate, as he had watched most of the tournament's coverage that summer, largely out of habit rather than any particular passion for the sport. He would later tell Detective Sergeant Nair that he could not explain, even to himself, what made him reach for the remote in that specific moment. It was not the young man's face, not exactly. 17 years is a long time, and Michael has said plainly, more than once, that he would never have claimed to recognize a grown man from a photograph of a 4-year-old boy. It was something smaller, a gesture perhaps, or the angle of the head as the young man turned to answer the reporter's question. Something that made Michael's hand move to the remote before his mind had caught up to why. He paused the frame. He leaned closer to the screen. And there, on the left side of the young man's neck, just below the jaw, was a small oval birthmark, roughly the size of a thumbprint. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to tell this part of the story as though it was simply magic, a father recognizing his son across 17 years and a television screen. Case closed. That is not in fact what happened, and it is not what the investigation would go on to establish. What Michael Whitmore actually had in that moment was a resemblance, a striking one by his own account, and one that matched a detail he had spent 17 years asking strangers to watch for. But a resemblance is not evidence, and to their considerable credit, both Michael and Eleanor understood this even as their hands shook, recording the paused broadcast on a mobile phone held up to the television screen. They did not call the press. They did not post the clip publicly, a decision Detective Sergeant Nair would later describe as unusually disciplined for parents in their position. Instead, at just past 10 that evening, Michael called the family liaison line directly, gave his case number from memory, a number he had apparently never once needed to look up in 17 years, and asked as calmly as he could manage for someone to review a piece of broadcast footage before the trail, whatever it was, went cold again. Would you have called the same night or waited until morning, worried the whole thing might be nothing more than wishful seeing? It's a question Michael has said he still turns over even now, whether it was instinct or simply 17 years of practiced vigilance that made him move so quickly. Detective Sergeant Nair, reviewing the footage the following morning, was careful not to promise the Whitmores anything. Birthmarks, as she reminded them gently, are not fingerprints. Resemblance fades in and out of family lines in ways that rarely mean what hopeful parents want them to mean. But she forwarded the clip to the Force's Forensic Imaging Unit regardless, along with a formal request to identify the broadcaster's full unedited footage from that segment, on the chance that a longer clip might include a name, a hometown, anything that could narrow an otherwise impossible search among tens of thousands of matchday attendees. What came back several days later was more than anyone on the investigating team had expected. The forensic imaging analysis, comparing archived photographs of Noah Whitmore against multiple frames extracted from the broadcast, flagged a series of biometric similarities considered statistically unusual for coincidence alone. The shape and set of the nose, the spacing between the eyes, the particular angle of the jawline, and the position of the ears relative to the hairline, all measurements that tend to remain stable, in broad proportion if not in exact size, from early childhood into adulthood. It was still, in the strict legal sense, nothing. No court in the country would have accepted a birthmark and a facial proportion analysis as proof of identity, but it was, for the first time in 17 years, more than a photograph on a mantle and a mother's private hope. It was enough, finally, to justify something the case file had not seen attempted in over a decade: locating, by name, the young man in that footage, and asking him, gently but formally, exactly who he believed himself to be. Locating him required cooperation from the broadcaster, who held the full, unedited footage from that evening's crowd interviews. The network's production team identified the segment by timestamp, cross-referencing it against accreditation records for that section of the stadium. The young man had not been a credentialed guest, simply a fan in the general admission crowd, selected at random by a field producer looking for a quick reaction. There was no name attached to the clip, only a rough description and a section number. It took investigators nearly 4 days, working with stadium ticketing and payment data, to narrow the pool of attendees to a manageable list, and 2 further days of quiet inquiry to confirm which individual matched the footage. When Daniel Moore's name surfaced, cross-referenced against a ticket purchase and a car park payment under his own bank card, Detective Sergeant Nair has said she felt something she rarely allowed herself in this line of work: a cautious flicker of hope that this file might actually have an ending. Eleanor and Michael were told only that a person of interest had been identified and that any contact would need to proceed carefully, through appropriate legal and psychological channels, rather than through a phone call or a knock at a stranger's door. It was, by every account, one of the hardest waiting periods of their 17 years, closer, in some ways, to the original search itself than to any of the quieter grief that had followed it. The young man's name, according to official records, was Daniel Moore, 21 years old, registered as living in a rented flat above a hardware shop in a small market town roughly 90 miles from Ashford. On paper, there was nothing remarkable about him at all: a birth date in early 2005, a national insurance number issued in the ordinary course of adolescence, a driving license, a part-time job at a warehouse distribution center. It was precisely this ordinariness, in fact, that investigators would later point to as the most carefully constructed part of the entire deception. It took Detective Sergeant Nair's team less than a week to find the first crack in that ordinariness. Daniel Moore's earliest medical record on file, a routine vaccination entry, was dated 2012, the year he would have been, according to his stated birth date, 7 years old. Investigators found no hospital birth record anywhere in the country matching his name and date of birth, no maternity ward discharge summary, no health visitor records from infancy, the kind every child born in the UK accumulates automatically through routine early years checks. No school enrollment prior to age 7, when he appeared, without prior record, at a small rural primary school under the guardianship of a man named Graham Moore, who was listed as his father. For a case that had gone 17 years without a single new lead, this was, in investigative terms, a landslide. A person does not simply appear in official records at age 7 with no earlier documentation, not in a country with the kind of routine early childhood healthcare infrastructure the UK maintains, unless someone had gone to considerable, deliberate effort to prevent that documentation from ever being created in the first place. Graham Moore, it turned out, offered his own set of gaps almost as soon as investigators began looking. He had died 2 years earlier, in 2024, of natural causes, in the same small market town, having lived there for just over a decade. Itself unusual, neighbours would later tell police, since Graham was known locally to have moved frequently in the years before that, never staying in one town for more than 3 or 4 years at a stretch. He described himself, when asked, as doing temporary farm work, an explanation vague enough to discourage further questions in communities where such arrangements were not unheard of, but specific enough to sound plausible. Those who had known him described a man who was polite but closed, someone who declined invitations easily and offered little about his past in return. He was, by multiple accounts, devoted to his son. Daniel was well cared for, well fed, reasonably social at school, even if a little withdrawn at home, and none of his teachers over the years reported anything that would have raised a formal safeguarding concern. He simply never allowed a photograph to be taken of himself, a detail several neighbours mentioned independently, and which investigators found in hindsight difficult to read as anything other than deliberate. How does a man build an entire childhood for another person's son without a single crack showing for 17 years? It's a question that troubled investigators as much as it will likely trouble you, and the honest answer, uncomfortable as it is, seems to be quietly, patiently, and by choosing, again and again, to disappear into places small enough that no one asked too many questions. A record search into Graham Moore's own documented history produced a second, deeper layer of the same pattern. Investigators traced at least 3 prior aliases used across different regions of the country dating back to the early 1990s, each supported by identification documents that, on closer forensic examination, showed signs of amateur but persistent forgery, altered dates, substituted photographs, minor but consistent inconsistencies in issuing authority formatting that would likely have gone unnoticed by anyone not specifically trained to look for them. Whoever Graham Moore had once been before he became Graham Moore was a question the investigation would spend considerable time trying, and largely failing, to fully answer. What mattered more, in the end, was not who he had been but what he had done and why. It was in a search of Graham's final residence, the small terraced house above the hardware shop where Daniel had grown up and where he still lived at the time of his identification, that investigators would find the answer to that second question. Hidden beneath the floorboards of a converted workshop at the back of the property, in a locked metal box that Daniel himself, questioned gently and repeatedly, insisted he had never known existed. Daniel's own recollection of his childhood, when investigators eventually spoke with him at length, offered no indication he had ever suspected anything unusual about his upbringing. He described a quiet, somewhat isolated home life, a father who worked long, irregular hours and moved them between 3 different towns before he was 10, and a general sense, common enough among only children of reserved single parents, that questions about the past were simply not encouraged. He remembered no mother, and had been told, from as early as he could recall, that she had left when he was an infant and had never been in contact since. A story investigators could find no record of ever having happened, since no woman had ever been formally associated with either Graham Moore's documented identity or Daniel's birth registration at all. He remembered snippets of an earlier home, he told investigators hesitantly, once pressed, a garden with a low stone wall, a dog that wasn't the one his father kept later, a woman's voice he could no longer place to a face. He had always assumed these were the ordinary, half-formed fragments any child eventually loses. It had never occurred to him they might be actual memories of a life interrupted before he turned 5. Investigators found this, once corroborated against the Whitmore's account of Noah's early home, quietly devastating. A 5-year-old's memory, faintly intact 17 years later, waiting for a context no one had offered it. Financial records showed Graham working a genuine, modest string of jobs over the years: groundskeeping, warehouse labor, occasional agricultural contracts, enough to explain a life that drew no attention through unexplained wealth. He paid taxes under his false identity for over a decade without difficulty, a fact that troubled investigators nearly as much as the abduction itself. The workshop at the back of the property had, according to Daniel, always been off-limits, not through any explicit rule, but through the quiet absolute authority his father held over that single room, the one space in an otherwise unremarkable home that Graham Moore never invited him into. Daniel told investigators he had assumed for most of his life that it was simply where his father kept old farm equipment, tools from the various temporary jobs he described but rarely discussed in detail. He said he had never once tried the door, not out of obedience exactly, but because it had simply never occurred to him to question it. That, investigators would later note, was perhaps the most telling detail of all. Not what Graham Moore had hidden, but how completely he had trained an entire childhood around never being asked. Forensic officers, working with a warrant obtained within hours of the biometric analysis results, found the metal box beneath a section of loose flooring near the workshop's rear wall, concealed under a layer of old sawdust and a stack of paint tins that appeared, deliberately or not, to discourage anyone from moving them. The box itself was unremarkable, a standard fireproof document case, the kind sold in any hardware shop, secured with a small combination lock that officers cut through rather than attempted to solve. Inside, Carefully preserved were the physical remains of a life Graham Moore had apparently never been able to fully let go of, even as he built an entirely new one on top of it. There were photographs of a young boy, unmistakably Noah Whitmore, taken in the days and weeks before June 2009. Images that matched, frame for frame in some cases, photographs already held in the Whitmore's own family albums, suggesting Graham had, in some capacity, observed the family closely enough beforehand to acquire them, or had taken his own from a distance without their knowledge. There were newspaper clippings, yellowed and carefully folded, chronicling the disappearance and the search that followed, spanning not weeks but years, well into the point where regional coverage had dwindled to a paragraph. There were 2 small toys, a wooden truck, and a stuffed rabbit missing one ear, both dated by manufacturer records to before 2009, both never mentioned in any account Daniel had ever given of his own childhood belongings. And there was a diary, not extensive, not the confession of a man eager to explain himself to anyone, but a private, irregular record spanning several years, written in a controlled, almost clinical hand that forensic document examiners would later describe as remarkably steady for the events it described. The earliest entries, dated shortly before June 2009, described the recent death of a son, Graham's own biological child, a boy who would have been close to Noah's age, who had died of a sudden illness the previous winter. The entries that followed described, in language investigators found difficult to categorize as anything other than a slow, private unraveling, a growing conviction that Graham could not continue living in a world that had taken his son from him, and an increasingly specific fixation on the idea of beginning again. A phrase that appeared in various forms across nearly a dozen separate entries in the months leading up to the fair. What do you make of a mind that arrives at a decision like that, not in a single moment of rage or impulse, but slowly, deliberately, across months of private grief that no one around him seemed to notice building? It is one of the harder questions this case leaves behind, and not one the file itself attempts to fully answer. The entry, dated the 12th of June 2009, was brief, almost startlingly so given what it described. Graham wrote of seeing a boy alone near a fenced play area, of a dog that had, in his words, always been good with children, of a decision made in what he described as less time than it takes to explain it. He did not describe fear or hesitation or any apparent understanding of what he was taking from 2 parents he had, by his own account, never met. He described instead relief, the specific, devastating relief of a grieving man who believed in that moment that he had found a way to undo a loss that could not actually be undone. The diary continued, sporadically for several more years, documenting Daniel's early childhood in fragments. A first day of school, a case of measles, a birthday celebrated under a name that was never truly his, before trailing off entirely sometime around 2016, as though Graham Moore had by then either resolved whatever guilt the early entries suggested, or simply stopped allowing himself to examine it any further. Forensic psychologists who later reviewed the diary at Detective Sergeant Nayar's request offered a cautious, careful assessment, one that stopped well short of excusing what Graham Moore had done while attempting to explain how a person arrives at such a place. They described a pattern consistent with acute, unresolved grief interacting with a personality already inclined towards secrecy and control, noting that Graham's history of assumed identities predating Noah's abduction by nearly 2 decades suggested a man who had, for reasons the file could not fully reconstruct, spent much of his adult life avoiding scrutiny of almost any kind, long before grief gave that avoidance a devastating new purpose. What the diary never addressed, notably, was any consideration of the Whitmores themselves, no acknowledgement of the search, the volunteers, the headlines, the 17 years of a mother carrying a photograph from room to room. Investigators found this absence almost as telling as anything the diary did contain. It suggested a man who had, quite deliberately, built an entire second life around, never allowing himself to think too closely about the first one he had destroyed, to make room for it. The box also held a handful of newer items, photographs of Daniel as a teenager, taken with his knowledge, alongside a folded certificate from a regional woodworking course Graham had completed in his final years. Detective Sergeant Nair suggested cautiously that these later additions reflected a man trying, however inadequately, to build something resembling an ordinary family record, layered directly on top of the evidence of how that family had actually come to exist. It was, in her words, one of the more unsettling contradictions in a case built almost entirely out of them. A diary, however detailed, is not proof. It is a confession, but confessions can be false, distorted, or in rare cases even fabricated by a mind seeking some private form of resolution that has nothing to do with actual events. Detective Sergeant Nair understood this, and so even with a locked box of photographs, newspaper clippings, and a dead man's handwriting describing a crime in his own words, the investigation moved forward exactly as it would have without any of it, through independent, verifiable science. Daniel Moore, informed gently and in the presence of a family liaison counselor of what investigators suspected, agreed voluntarily to a full battery of identity confirmation testing. A DNA sample was collected and compared against reference samples the Whitmores had provided years earlier, samples kept on file for precisely this improbable possibility. Dental records, though limited given Noah's age at disappearance, were compared against Daniel's own history for consistency in early tooth development patterns. A faint scar on Daniel's left knee, the result, he said, of a childhood fall he could not specifically recall, was cross-referenced against a hospital record from May 2009, documenting a minor injury sustained by Noah Whitmore barely a month before the fair. The oval birthmark on the left side of his neck was measured, photographed, and compared directly against the same mark visible in Noah's earliest childhood photographs. And a forensic facial reconstruction team, working from age progression software calibrated against the original 2009 photographs, produced a projected adult likeness that investigators would later say matched Daniel Moore's actual adult face with a precision rarely seen outside laboratory conditions. The DNA result, returned 11 days after the initial broadcast that started it all, confirmed what the diary, the birthmark, and 17 years of a mother's insistence had already suggested. Daniel Moore was Noah Whitmore. The reunion, when it finally happened, bore almost none of the drama such moments carry in films. It took place in a quiet family support suite attached to the regional police headquarters, arranged carefully by specialists in reunification cases, with a clinical psychologist present throughout to guide a process that everyone involved understood would be delicate, complicated, and almost certainly disappointing in ways that no one wanted to say aloud beforehand. Noah, and it will take his parents time, investigators noted gently, to fully think of him by that name again, remembered almost nothing of his life before the age of 7. He had grown up believing, without a single reason to doubt it, that Graham Moore was his biological father, and that the disjointed, sparse details of his early childhood, the ones he could vaguely recall, were simply the ordinary gaps of any young child's incomplete memory. Eleanor Whitmore, in the one interview the family agreed to give after the case formally closed, described the reunion not as a moment of joy exactly, though there was joy in it, but as something closer to meeting a grown stranger who happened to carry unmistakably in his face, his gestures, even the particular way he tilted his head when listening, the boy she had spent 17 years refusing to stop looking for. "He is not the 4-year-old I lost," she said, "but he is not a stranger either. He is something in between, and we are learning slowly what that means." Would you have known him, watching that broadcast, the way Michael did? It is a question this case leaves open for anyone willing to sit with it. How much of a person actually remains recognizable across 17 years and an entirely different name, and how much of what Michael saw that night was recognition at all, rather than simply 17 years of hope finally finding a face to attach itself to. North Yorkshire Police formally closed the case file in August 2026, recording their conclusion plainly. Noah Whitmore was abducted on the 12th of June 2009 by Graham Moore, who acted alone, motivated by grief following the death of his own son, and who constructed a new identity for the child using forged documentation sustained over more than a decade. The broadcast that reopened the case, investigators were careful to note in their closing summary, did not itself solve anything. It provided, in Detective Sergeant Nayar's own words, the first genuinely new piece of information this investigation had received in 17 years, a single unremarkable frame among thousands of hours of tournament footage, watched by millions and recognized in the end by exactly one person who had spent nearly 2 decades waiting for a reason to look twice. This case has stayed with our research team longer than most we've covered, not because of any single twist, but because of how ordinary every individual piece of it turns out to be once you lay it all out. A fair, a dog, a grieving man, a birthmark, a television broadcast. None of it, on its own, is extraordinary. It is only together, across 17 years, that it becomes something almost impossible to believe actually happened. Before we close this file, we want to be transparent with you, as we try to be at the end of every case we bring to this archive. This story is a fictional narrative, inspired by the real emotional weight carried by families of missing persons, and by the genuine ongoing work of investigators who spend careers on cases that may never resolve. Noah Whitmore, Graham Moore, Daniel Moore, and the Ashford Fairground are not real individuals or events. We tell stories like this one not to sensationalize real tragedy, but to reflect honestly on how these situations unfold, and on the quiet endurance of the people who live through them. Thank you sincerely for spending this time with us. If this case moved you, we would genuinely like to know what you make of it in the comments below, whether you think Michael would have recognized his son without that birthmark, or what you imagine those first months of reunion might actually look like for a family finding its way back to each other after 17 years apart. If you'd like to see more cases reconstructed with this same care, consider liking this video and subscribing to join us for the next file in this archive. Until then, take care of each other.